about today's subject, energy resilience. We're pulling this information right off the headlines based off what's happened in the U.S. in the last couple of weeks. Our thoughts today are all about preparing for the future. My name is John Heltzel. I'm the Director for Resilience Planning, and we appreciate you making time to be with us today. Just a couple of housekeeping items, and I'll mention them a couple of times. This webinar is being recorded, and we will make the recording and the slides available after the session. If you would look in the chat window, you will see that we've added some information that you might find of interest. The link for our Amazon book recently published on electromagnetic pulse is available from Amazon. And you will be able to see a link there will take you to our LinkedIn page, and you can follow our activities on LinkedIn. Again, my name is John Heltzel. I'm very excited to kick off this session today. We've got a great presentation for you. You'll notice that we've got speakers that cover a wide variety of areas of interest that all have to do with energy resilience. And I think you're going to be very interested in the perspectives and thoughts that they will share with you today. But I'm going to go ahead and move on into this so we can make more time for questions at the end of this session. Speaking of questions, if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the question box, and we will do our best to either answer them on this session or on our follow-on session, which is the Energy Resilience Forum, which will occur about 15 minutes after we close this session out. The link is there on the screen if you want to try to grab that. I did send the link out to everyone last night that was registered, but I know we had a few people come in this morning. The forum is a little more laid back, and we will take all your questions and do the best we can to present that information and our thoughts on that background. So please join us for the Resilience Forum. A lot of talk, a lot of discussion, and I think you'll enjoy that opportunity. I want to highlight a couple of our partners today. We thank Omni Threat Structures for once again being a partner for the EIS Council and the Global Resilience Commission. Great organization, and we'll share a little bit of information about them in the forum. But also a new partner today, Blackstar Technology. We first ran into Blackstar about a year ago, as a matter of fact. An amazing group that has quite a bit of opportunities to ensure your resilience is at the utmost level. I'm sure there are people that have just suffered through this latest blackout conditions. I would have loved to have had some of the Blackstar capabilities. So please keep up with them, and then in the forum, they'll get a chance to talk a little bit about their technology. When we talk about the Global Resilience Commission, there are a few things we'd like to share as we kick off. One is that this idea for the commission really came out of what we experienced in 2020 and continue to experience today with COVID-19. We are now facing, even though we've talked about it for a few years, we are now facing truly globalized impacts from different events, and we need to be prepared for these. Globalization, amazing capabilities, has brought costs under control in a lot of areas, engaged a lot of different entrepreneurs and partnerships across the globe, but it does have its own share of risk, and we need to understand that risk so that we can adjust and make sure that we're resilient. Our vision is to work with private sector and government and individuals to ensure that we're building these global scale resilience efforts. And it all starts with understanding the threat and the planning. And that is the focus of what we're doing with these commission events. And I hope you will continue to join us as we go forward. We're going to cover a wide variety of events this year and a lot of opportunities if you're interested to actually become part of our team. Our focus, though, is on planning for the things that we can implement in the near term. I've often made the comment that a 10-year plan in today's environment is somewhat suspect just because it thinks it can envision what 10 years from now is. However, some of our threats, like climate change, need to be thought about in the out years, but we need to take action now to minimize the impact. A few points just to highlight where we're at. We want to help everyone avoid the idea of fighting the last war. And the last war may be best characterized by some of our planning methodologies that talk about being able to plan about all hazards. One of my good friends is actually on this call today, made a comment recently that some disasters can't simply be scaled up to. You need to plan for them in a different direction. You can't just do more of the same thing. And we think the black sky hazards that you see listed there are some of these where we need a new approach to planning. And we think teaming and work groups like the ones that are showing up for our GRCom sessions are the right kind of people. And we're going to need some new languages and some new terms to deal with this, things that deal with what we saw in COVID with supply chain fragility and this idea of being able to do restoration on lifeline compatible systems. And the idea that we need new tools like COAST, like Genome, and all of these are under development, and you can have a voice in helping us move these forward. Bottom line is, though, we're about the protection of critical facilities and capabilities in each one of the critical sectors, which basically is every sector. Today, what we want to talk a little bit about, which is the theme, which is emergency power. How do we ensure that the grid stays up? But if the grid gets taken down, what do we do to ensure that emergency power is available for all? And what steps need to be taken to ensure that localities, regional government structures, private sector has the information they need and has the opportunity to take advantage of these capabilities and move it forward? One of the things you will hear us talk about both in the EIS Council and the Global Resilience Commission is that we want to look for doable, cost-effective solutions. That's what's going to work. How do we embed into the private sector the ability to make these tools available at a reasonable cost? And that's our goal. So today, it's my pleasure to hand off the facilitation for this session to Mr. Frank Koza. For those of you all who have been with us, Frank's been on many of the calls up to date. Does a great job for us as our critical infrastructure energy coordinator. And Frank, with that, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our panel and drive things forward. Thanks.
Okay, John, thanks, and add my welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining the February session of the Global Resilience Commission. The way we're going to do this, we do have 4 presenters today, as the first slide showed you. Those presentations will go like 10 to 12 minutes, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end to go into some Q&A. So without further ado, I want to bring up our first speaker. I want to introduce Gladys Brown-Dutrell. Gladys is the chair of the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission. And in addition to Gladys's work with the commission, she's also involved at the national level with NARUC and heavily involved with resilience issues. So Gladys, first of all, thanks for joining us, and please proceed with the presentation.
Thanks, Frank, and greetings to everyone. Thank you for extending an invitation to me to talk about what we have been doing in Pennsylvania as well as on the NARUC level. We can skip that slide of me. You've heard enough about me. Let me just talk generally on the next slide about what I want to discuss today, and that is generally about what we in Pennsylvania have been doing as it refers to black sky planning, as well as the continued conversation on the national level through the NARUC Critical Infrastructure Committee, and really focusing on the role of the regulators as it refers to black sky planning. So in our next slide, we have to start with the basics, and that would be the general definition of what we were looking at in terms of black sky events. It may seem simple to many of you that are on the line here because you're focusing more and more about that, but we as regulators were focusing on our statutory responsibilities as it refers to the distribution systems that we look at and our entities that we regulate dealing with the distribution system. We've also been focusing on a lot of weather-related outages. So when you bring into the mix more long-term outages, that may include something like a cyber attack, a EMP, something of that nature, we start to get a little nervous, if I can use that term, because it takes us out of the normal box that we're in. But it's important to look at these issues, and we on the national level, as well as in Pennsylvania, realize that. And over the last decade or even more, we've been starting to focus more and more on what we need to do in addition to just the weather-related outages. If we can go to my next slide. So in Pennsylvania, I wanted to focus on some of the great work that we've been doing with the working relationship with the EIS Council. The EIS Council was introduced to us as a commission back in 2016, where they came to Pennsylvania to have a black sky training exercise, exercise. And the importance of that is the people that were actually in the room, and the fact that we were able to get the governor thought it was very important to bring in the EIS Council and to bring in the heads of each of the agencies. And also we were talking about the CEOs for each of the utilities that we regulate, and then those utilities that we don't. We don't normally have jurisdiction over municipal utilities, but we thought in the conversation and the discussion, they needed to be in the room as well as our federal partners. We know that any type of major outage, whether it's regional or national, it's not going to start and end with us as a state commission. We have to partner together, and we learned more and more about the interdependencies and planning for it in advance. So we can go to our next slide, or my next slide. In our conversations, as I stated before, we realized the importance of the interdependencies. And in the conversation in June of 2016, our attendees, the CEOs and federal partners and different state agencies, we realized that if there's an emergency to take place, it has to start with the governor's offices for each of the states within that region, as well as working with the utilities. So we thought it was important to bring together what we call Black Sky Working Group, which ended up being more formal as we go along, as we went along in terms of our continued conversations. Any type of emergency within our state, and probably the same in any state, starts with the governor's office or their emergency management agency. So we partnered in Pennsylvania with our emergency management agency, which is PEMA, as well as our governor's office of Homeland Security, which has also been working on different issues in terms of cybersecurity. Partnering together, we realized that those three agencies could really bring in the focus for our state on Black Sky events and planning for it, not planning for it as the event is happening, but planning for it in advance to know exactly what you need to do. And with that, as you can see in that slide, I'm not going to go through all those details. We started working on these different things, and we put together more formally the Black Sky Steering Committee, which is comprised not only of us as state agencies and private industries that we regulate, but the non-government entities as well. And I would throw in there the municipal entities and even the electric co-ops. We just thought it was important to have everyone in the room. And as we moved forward, we started sharing some of the information that we have learned through the EIS Council and working more with our federal partners and learning more about these Black Sky events that we start sharing with other state agencies as well. You see on that list that New Jersey was a state commission that really was looking at Black Sky events. We started sharing with them the information that we received. And then also, as I became the chair of the NARUC Critical Infrastructure Committee the following year in 2018, I was also able to expand upon sharing more and more information. As you can see we had our kickoff of this Black Sky Steering Committee in a more formal manner back in November of 2017, and it still continues today. And I want to talk a little bit more about that as we move on to the next slide. So as I referred to, as we formally kicked it off in 2017, we moved more so into putting a formal structure in place in 2018, and also trying to identify the areas that we wanted to focus on. And after some back and forth, we decided to focus on those 4 lifeline sector areas that we thought was important in any type of emergency. And that would be the water, wastewater, the energy, communications, as well as transportation. And we put together also an executive level work group that also would review the different work of the subcommittees or the work groups that were within the Black Sky Steering Committee. We also decided, we needed to also participate in other types of national tabletop exercises, and you see the EIS EarthX that we participated in 2018. And then also we continue with the meeting of our different work groups. We leaning on the expertise as we move into my next slide, leaning on the expertise of the EIS Council and having different conversations with them, we realized as we wanted to get more and more information out to the NARUC states, how can we do that? And we used the platform of bringing EIS Council in to have a Black Sky tabletop exercise at the July 2019 NARUC summer policy event, they are still talking about it today. Even in the midst of a pandemic, they were still talking about the information that they learned, how important it was. Every state is in a different position as they refer to or relate to in terms of what they need to put in place for dealing with black sky events. I can say generally that every state is, when I say they're in a different position, some are even concerned about how far they need to go. Is it really their primary responsibility, or should they just leave it up to their utilities to handle these different types of things? I can say to you, when it comes to the expectation of the members of their General Assembly or legislature, they truly would go to their state commission. And I think people are starting to realize that more and more. So as you see some of the information and timeline that we've been working on, we continue to work on all of this. Even though we got a little disrupted with the pandemic, I still think the conversations that are going on the national level are still good conversations. And with that, you see that NARUC is bringing out more and more publications as educational tools that are working well for educating the state commissions about what they need to do or can do. That gives them the tools that they need to figure out what works best for them and their states, and still identifying ways to educate their employees. We also know that every state commission is in a different position because of the fact that they may not have the funding to have more staff as part of their commission to work on these type of events, or maybe they need just more ideas and information of how they can train staff, existing staff that they have, to learn more about this issue. We in Pennsylvania did just that before we actually hired someone to come on full time in 2018. We still have that working group in place. They have their regular day-to-day job, but they have the additional responsibilities of learning more about cybersecurity, black sky events, what we can do as a state, how we can help our other state agencies, and things of that nature. Pennsylvania has been very active in so much information, and in giving out that information. I've just listed a couple of different links, and I know that these slides are available to you at a later date. So you'll be able to click onto them and look at some of the information, the publications that either NARUC has presented to different state commissions, or publications. If you go on the NARUC website, you can see publications that they actually put in place for resource and material for state commissions. If we can move on to the next slide. I think that slide really gets into more detail of what NARUC also has been doing to educate state commissions. The importance of being prepared for any type of black sky event, you can see, has increased in terms of the interest by NARUC to the point that in October of 2019, NARUC started their first, they created a task force, which is referred to as the Emergency Preparedness, Recovery, and Resiliency Task Force, or EPRR, another acronym that we need to learn, to put in place to consider different issues and opportunities facing the regulatory community associated with emergency preparedness, recovery, and resiliency. And I know from my conversations with the EIS Council and different federal partners, resiliency is definitely the issue, the concern, just being able to recover those costs and putting things in place to prepare for any type of long-term outages. So I have been honored to be selected to serve as the chair of this of the subcommittee within this task force, and that's the subcommittee on black sky events. And so also my vice chair is Phil Mueller, who is the executive vice president, business operations and group regulatory affairs for the EEI. So happy that Phil is working with me. Their organization has a wealth of information to provide for us. And if you go on to the next slide, you can see from that slide the focus of the task force in terms of also focusing on the Black Sky Subcommittee, and they're looking to examine scenarios involving catastrophic multi-state, multi-sector events affecting utility infrastructure and service, and develop that playbook that state commissions need to help them, give them the tools that they need. And as you can see by the picture there, that was the July 2019 Black Sky Tabletop that took place at NARUC summer event. I can tell you that's the first time it's ever happened, and it was a 3.5, 4-hour activity that commissioners had to sign up for in advance. You know, we only had a certain number of seats so people could take part in that, and there were so many commissioners that were upset that they couldn't do it because they might have had another committee. But here we realized the importance of, from one event in 2019 to the creation of this steering committee and having a subcommittee dealing with Black Sky events. So it's really important to NARUC and really more so important to the state commissions, which are the members of it. Our kickoff event, as I already stated, was back in October of 2021. We actually just awarded a contract to Converge, which is a organization by Jonathan Munkin, who also was a part of the EIS Council, and we first met them in 2016. So we're very happy to have him on board to help out with this steering committee. My next slide is coming up, and I know my time is coming up as well. But I do want to delve into, as you see on this slide, I know it's very dense slide, very small print. I'm not going to read all of it, but really is focusing on what NARUC and also what Pennsylvania has learned in our experience in terms of dealing with energy resilience. As I stated before, we know that our focus as state commissions has always traditionally been dealing with the weather-related outages and being prepared for a 3 to 5 day outage and not the long-term type outages. And and realizing and delving into the issues, you realize that it's not the same when you're dealing with a Black Sky event. You can't prepare exactly the same way as you would for weather-related outages. So I list here some of the things that we're looking at, trying to deal with as a state agency. And then we also pass this along to our state commissions on the NARUC level to focus. I would say that as a state regulator and dealing with resiliency and recovery of costs, that I'll focus on cybersecurity, that may deal with cybersecurity. We are concerned, and concern may be the wrong word, but there's the hesitancy as a state regulator to make sure that there's not too much in terms of additional costs being passed on to the consumer. So you have to find that fine balance in terms of what's appropriate and what is not appropriate, because that's the normal traditional rate making that we deal with. So having this information and tools and resources available to commissioners to be able to find that balance, find where there is the need and what's appropriate in terms of the prudent expenditures that commissions should approve for these costs is vital to us, and the continued discussion and operation and participating in events like this and other tabletop exercises is very invaluable. So I give you all that to say these are the things that we look at, and then I think that's my last slide, so I can turn it over for any questions or questions at the end.
We're going to try questions at the end, Gladys. Thanks very much. We appreciate that. Our next speaker joining us from Israel is Dr. Gideon Friedman. Gideon is chief scientist at the Israel Energy Ministry. So Gideon, thanks for joining us. And Gideon will kind of talk about resilience, particularly as related to renewable energy. Gideon, please go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and good evening for those of you that are watching from Israel. Yes, I would like to talk a little bit about the relation between renewable energy and resilience. I will start with the events in Texas, because I think we cannot neglect that. There's been some debate as to the source of the problems in Texas, and what the data here is supposed to show you that it's absolutely no relation to renewable energy. What you see here on the top are three demand curves for 3 different days, one in the summer and 2 in the winter, including the forecast on the 16th of February, which was at the height of the storm. You can see the gray one on top is the demand forecast for the 16th of February, which was very high. However, we can see similar curves. One from the summer has a peak in the evening rather than in the morning, a peak demand, and one which is a typical low wind day in the winter with high demand. So this is the blue one on the top. The red one also on the top is the actual generation. You can, on the 16th of February, you can see that the actual generation is by a far cry lower than the demand on that day, which caused all the trouble. At the bottom, you can see the wind production on these 3 days. So basically what I'm saying, and you can see the numbers in the data, in the table here, that the difference between the peak demand and what the wind produced on these 3 days is quite significant. In the summer of 2019, the difference between the wind production at the peak demand time and the wind consumption is about 65 megawatts. In the winter of 2019, in March 2019, the difference was close to 60 megawatts, and presumably during this height of the storm, there was just not enough power, not from the wind, because the wind is not producing very much there, nor in the other days, but the normal generation is just not there. And of course, it's across the line. The problems were from freezing power stations, main, even nuclear power stations, 2 problems in the gas supply, the pumps on the gas supply, and the high demand in the gas supply caused some stations to close because there was not enough gas. Basically, the bottom line from this is that resilience needs to be built across the board for all the generation. And of course, renewable in this case did not play a major part at all, and should not. So we should not build on renewables to be a significant provider there. I would like to show you a slide from 2014 where we presented what are the advantages of renewable energy. And we were racking our brains to say what are the reasons to bring in renewable energy when it was more expensive than gas at the time. And the main reason that we actually put then in 6 years ago is the energy security and diversity. We see that as a very important thing. What we mean by security is the availability at all times, and diversity we means not only rely on gas for Israel in this case. We are mainly we are for the future, for 2025 or 2030, we will only have the fossil fuel that will provide the power in Israel will be gas only. So we need diversity for other resources. Of course, the other reasons are still existent. They are important. Next slide, please. John, thank you. So what are the sensitive points in today's system in Israel? The sensitive points are the gas fields, the gas rigs that treat the gas coming out of the fields, central gas transmission. We have the main power plants, which also work on gas mostly. We have a few coal power plants running about 30% of our generation annually, but they will be closed by 2025. However, the main power plants are still a source for concern. They are each of them producing a large quantity of energy. And of course, the main the main switching points, I call them here. I mean the voltage switching stations. Next slide, please. Because wind and solar in Israel, mostly solar, are intermittent, whenever you plan for your power market, you cannot rely on them as being a reliable producer. So you have to build your market in a way that will work even without or almost without these resources. This is a must. We saw it in Texas, okay? We saw it in some sense in California. Normally, this is what is should be done, and in Israel, at least, we try to do it. So we have backup. We always have to have backup for the wind and solar, and of course, we need to have storage, which I will talk about a little bit later. The backup. Okay, the backup creates redundancy, and the redundancy is important because it gives you an extra cushion. So the renewable can come in handy whenever there is a disaster. You must not rely on it, but it can be. And as for storage, of course, for any renewable energy penetration in significant amounts, we must have storage. So the sun only shines a few hours a day. We must provide outside those hours electricity, and the sun may be intermittent, as I said, with the clouds here and there. In terms of the storage technologies, we are making progress all the time, which is quite impressive. Lithium ion is the industry standard today. It looks very positive for the future. Prices will go down, quantities will go up. But we do not need to concern ourselves as this being the only technology. So if we have problems with the lithium ion because there is a low availability of lithium or cobalt or some other material, or there is a long-term shortage, there will be other technologies, because the other technologies are just waiting behind the lines to a problem with or slowdown with the lithium ion, and we will have other technologies. However, the batteries do not give us a solution long term. We need, if we want to have a real backup, we need long term and large quantities. And here we have a starting competition between hydrogen and normal storage. So I want to talk a little bit now about parallels between PV and storage, which also have implications for the market. What I show here is the steep decline in prices for the PV panels and the lithium-ion batteries. On the left-hand side, you can see the decline over about 40 years or more, actually. It's shown on the x-axis in terms of quantities of panels produced, which is increased logarithmically. The plot here is logarithmic, so the price decline is exponential, in fact. A similar pattern is seen on the batteries. The last 10 years, the prices have decreased approximately 20% a year for almost 90% or 85% over a decade, which is very impressive. So this is very similar. And why is this happening? Next slide, please. The main point, I think, is that the base unit is modular and small. The PV field can be one panel, and it can be millions of panels. And the production is in the millions of the same thing. So there is a huge room for industrialization, and this is what made the big change. For lithium-ion batteries, the situation is very similar. The cells are very small, and the batteries can be built for a computer, can be built for a car, or can be built for power plants with many megawatt hours of storage. So this is a very important parallel. It will play a role in the near future because we can have at home the storage in small quantities, and the prices of the home storage or the small scale storage will go down much more quickly than the continuing price decline of the market in general, because the high prices today for the small units comes from the electronics and whatever is around the batteries. Next slide, please. The key point which both the PV and the storage play is that they provide us the option of local power generation. This is a game changer in my view, the local power generation. Next slide, please. And why is that? I give you an example here. Just for your thought, there are many other examples. I'm sure there are more examples that we have not thought about even today. But why does the local power changing everything? Because, for example, if we have, we're thinking about water supply, and Israel relies on desalination. Of course, the desalination relies on electricity. So what happens when we have no electricity? Are we going to have a water shortage? Of course, there are pumping stations also. We need to take care of the pumping stations. But the production of water, the desalination plant, can have local power generation and not necessarily rely all the time on the power. So just an example. There are many other examples. Next slide, please. Do we have enough power in local generation? The answer is not an absolute yes. It's not so simple, but normally yes. A lot of times yes. We have a challenge in the winter in Israel, for example. There are, first of all, there's a lot less sun in the winter, and there are times where we can have several days without sun. So the answer is not completely yes, but it partially yes. And with some storage and with energy management, we can most probably overcome the problems. I talk about it in a paper that I recently wrote, and I will not go into details, but I can give you some example of the storage solutions that can be handy whenever you don't have sun for several days. One is a battery, a backup battery of the type, for example, provided by a company called Finergy. This is an aluminum air battery. It's not being recharged at home. It needs to be recharged by a power plant, but it's much more compact. You can store 100 kilowatt hours in a small box. The technology is based on aluminum air, so it means basically the aluminum is the source of the energy. Of course, the standard today that people are talking about is hydrogen or synthetic fuels. We can store them for a while. So if we overproduce in the summer, for example, we can store these fuels for the long term. It's not completely, it's something that we can foresee already today. It doesn't make economic sense, but we can certainly see this, and we can use the resiliency agenda in order to push this forward. And cars also can play an important role. Cars have huge batteries on the scale of homes. So if we have a car at home, even a battery operated car, or certainly a fuel cell car with hydrogen in it, then the car can provide the emergency energy. Now, okay, if we're talking about the local generation, we need to talk a little bit about the structure of the system. I will do it very briefly because my time is closing. Of course, the traditional structure of the electricity market was for centralized power, and then it's distributed down the line to the homes. And with the tomorrow, we want to have a much a flatter system where there is local generation. So okay, let's continue. The center for this is a microgrid. The word microgrid has many meanings, and I also think that it has many levels. The microgrid can start at home with the nanogrids. We need to have an energy management system for the home, and then we need to have an energy management system for the house or the apartment building, and then we need to have a management system for the street and the neighborhood, and then maybe the local municipality, and then the state or the country. So the microgrid gives us the everyday optimization, but also the microgrid is important because the energy management is very important for resiliency. In emergency times, we may not be able to use all the energy that we want for every day. So we need to be able to control what we consume to a lower level if necessary. And if we have local production, how are we going to control it? Of course, the absurd way is a central control, which some people think they can do. You know, they can optimize the system if they have the system operator. The system operator knows everything. System operator will manage all the local production. I think it doesn't make sense, and we can see in the next slide, which is essentially my last slide, a structure which to me makes a lot more sense. There is a peer-to-peer communication, peer-to-peer energy transfer, even if it's virtual. There must be multiple routes. There must be redundancy in the way the energy is transmitted. Resource optimization is not done on the central level, but on a local level. Every node manages itself and tries to optimize against its peers and they get at a higher level, which essentially gives us a potential resilience. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Gideon. We appreciate your comments and thoughts, and particularly on renewables. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Jonathan Monken. Actually, Gladys introduced Jonathan, which is great. But Jonathan is now principal at Converge Strategies and been in the resilience space for a long time. So we want to bring some of Jonathan's practical experience in the presentation. Jonathan, please proceed.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Frank, and thanks for the opportunity to be here and participate in the discussion here today. So I'll keep this as efficient as possible, recognizing that Bill's coming in close behind me and he's got a wealth of knowledge that I want to make sure everybody has the opportunity to hear. So what I'm going to focus on right now is when we look at resilience conceptually, I think one of the most important lessons that we can take away from events like the one that just occurred in Texas is that resilience doesn't happen by accident, it happens by design. And so that's for better or for worse. So if a system is not designed to be inherently resilient, it's not going to perform that way. So essentially what I want to focus on here is some work that we've done at Converge Strategies specifically to support these resilience-based outcomes, not just generally, but very specifically to meet community resilience outcomes that a specific area in Florida really wanted to accomplish with the deployment of renewable technology to make sure that they could meet that end state. So essentially the first principle here, and this is, I think, where a lot of times projects get derailed because they're really one note in nature. They're overemphasizing one particular aspect of the resilience it's going to deliver, or the technology that's used. So essentially the concept here is that this rising tide of resilience should genuinely lift all boats. And when we talk about what boats are involved in this, certainly you have these intersections between local governments that are trying to achieve very specific outcomes on behalf of their population or constituents, public safety personnel that have this no-fail contract to provide services to the population impacted by a disaster. And then also this technology component of understanding that there are a lot of different ways that you can bring them forward to achieve these resilience outcomes, but you really have to understand what they can or can't do, what limitations exist, or what technical hurdles need to be cleared in order to get there. Next slide, please. So essentially, when you're trying to figure out what's critical, if you want to really develop resilience, you need to start at the beginning and understand what is it, what outcome are you trying to accomplish with the deployment of a resilient energy solution, or to try and bolster community resilience. And a great place to start is the framework that FEMA put together around community lifelines, and essentially understanding what the desired end state of a energy resilience investment is going to be, meaning which one of these lifelines it ultimately supports and to what degree, is a really important part of the equation when you're trying to justify the investment, when you're trying to pull together stakeholders around a project that doesn't fit the traditional mold of energy development. So you really need something that establishes a strong case, shows a tangible benefit, and that's what I want to talk through today, is what we ultimately developed to allow local government planners or sustainability planners, even emergency management and utility personnel to do that. Next slide. So essentially what we developed is this siting framework and analysis process. And these are really the four fundamental tenets of what needs to be considered and ultimately addressed if you really want to increase not just the chances of getting this investment across the finish line, but making sure that it has the desired resilience benefit that you intended at the beginning. So first part of it is the critical facility assessment. So essentially this is one of those issues that you run into with great frequency, especially when you're engaging with utilities, which is if everything's important, then nothing's important. So when you say, well, the number one priority is a hospital, and the number one priority is a police station, and the number one priority is a shelter location, and the number one priority is a water purification facility, you really have to understand within context how these facility types can be compared to one another through the lens of those community lifelines and understand what has relative impact. Certainly what we're seeing unfolding in Texas right now is it would be, if you're looking at how these types of facilities could have been prioritized to fundamentally change the outcome, the availability of clean water and the treatment facilities necessary to do that were clearly of paramount importance. And when those lost power, they lost the ability to deliver to more than 10 million people the clean water they needed, and facilities like hospitals that are completely dependent on access to potable water in order to treat patients. As you move through this critical facility assessment, and you try and identify what is the value of having energy resilience at that particular site. This is one of the biggest challenges that people face, is it's not just a pure economic return on investment. You have to understand what the net community benefits ultimately are and how much that is really worth to the local government, to the local business, and understanding how you can quantify that in a meaningful way. Then you have to transition into this energy site assessment. Every site is going to be different. It's not a one size fits all. However, the principles of how you assess these sites and what types of variables are most important, that is something that is consistent from site to site. And you can apply that in a way that allows you to have a much more apples to apples comparison of the end result. And the last part is trying to quantify this benefit cost analysis. There are tools that are out there that have been developed by national labs that are in practical use on a regular basis, that are free to use, that can give you much more insight into how much ultimate benefit you get based on a certain level of investment in these types of technologies. So this example that's shown right here is called Reop Lite. So the next one is engaging with utilities in a very different way. So essentially, utilities are certainly engaged on a regular basis when there's negotiations about electricity rates, when there's discussions around outages and how quickly they're going to be restored. But the fundamental change here is that you need to engage utilities as a strategic partner, not as an afterthought that once I already have my plans, I've designated my facilities, I've already run this cost benefit, I know where I want to go. Essentially, what you need to do is have a better understanding of the utility emergency preparedness process. They have one that's developed. They have priorities of their own that they've identified. And if you can support in really as a combination of what you're trying to do to support some of their requirements at the same time, your chances of improved or efficient integration and your chances of financial backing for it go up dramatically. So trying to understand how they identify critical infrastructure sites, how they prioritize the restoration of individual customers or facilities can go a long ways to both advising your own process and ensuring the shared benefit of the ultimate project. This certainly gives you a different analysis of cost and benefit. It's not about just an individual investor making an individual decision. There could be larger benefits to the grid that surrounds that particular facility from both a transmission and a distribution perspective that would only be known if you engage the utility in a meaningful way. And the last part is just trying to gauge the interest of the utility in resilience benefits overall. Certainly they have a strong interest in reliability because those are the metrics by which they're measured on a regular basis. The real question here is trying to figure out what resilience activities or planning is really underway at the utility and how that can be mutually supported. Recognizing that if there are shared investments that can be made, if you can be strategic about where you place these assets because it's on a portion of the distribution system that's either generation poor, it doesn't have local resources that can be leveraged, or even if there are feeder constraints on specific areas of the grid that you need to be aware of before you try and scale an investment, all of those things are really, really important at the front end. Next slide, please. Essentially, the desired end state here is this integration of both process and site prioritization between either a government partner who's making an investment and the utility that currently provides services. So if you can really crack the code on how these benefits are ultimately calculated, how the project is sized, designed, the technical specifications, you're really going to find this win-win territory that you really want to pursue to make sure that you're maximizing the benefit to the organizations that are directly impacted by this energy resilience investment. Next slide. So one of the biggest questions that you get on a regular basis is how do you choose between these methods? How do you quantify in different ways? And essentially, you really have to ask these fundamental questions. What is the maximum outage duration that the facility can handle and still deliver essential functions? That's a really important question. So again, if you go back to things like water purification facilities in Texas, the answer that they found out the hard way is you only have about a day. If it's more than 24 hours, you're in a set of conditions where it's not easy to just restart the system. So you have these thresholds that need to be considered for operation. Same thing is true of scalability. So when we talk about distributed energy resources, which is usually how people refer to renewables in this context, trying to figure out how it can scale to different geographic levels is very, very important. Where it is may be just as important as what it's supporting or what type of technology is ultimately used. So just understanding the relative scalability of the resilience benefit that you're trying to have is very important. Certainly ease of use is something that has guided a lot of investment up until now. If it's difficult, if it's complicated, if it's expensive, people aren't going to do it. You want something that's replicable, and certainly the scope of the outputs. So understand who you're trying to provide benefit to and try and paint that in context for people that have a role to play in the planning process, design, funding, and ultimate implementation. So lots of things to consider, and certainly I look forward to more discussion to go. So Frank, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, Jonathan, thanks very much. We appreciate it. Our last speaker is Bill Chu. Bill Chu is Managing Director of Grid Modernization and Resiliency at Southern California Edison. And ironically, Bill's not going to talk about Southern California Edison, but he's going to talk about work that he's done with the IEEE. So Bill, we appreciate you being here. Please proceed. And Bill, by the way, don't worry about the question and answers. We'll deal with that in the second hour. So please do your presentation.
All right, thank you, Frank, and hello, everyone. So it's really both a pleasure and a privilege for me to be here today. I know Gladys, Gideon, and Jonathan have already provided some really good considerations on resilience. So what I like to do is build on that and share a few thoughts on a recent white paper that was published by the IEEE Power Engineering Society's Industry Technical Leadership Committee. We formed a task force on resilience, and this white paper really came out of the collaboration between DOE and IEEE PES, and was intended to be a strategic roadmap or report, if you will, on resilience framework analyses and practices more specific to the electric grid. I serve as the task force chair for this effort, so I thought it'd be good for me to share some of the key takeaways. If you're interested in this white paper, it's available for download at the PES Resource Center using the link shown on the cover slide. I do wanted to give credit to the group of authors and peer reviewers that made tremendous contribution to this white paper, and I know for a fact that such undertaking would not have been possible without the support of many dedicated IEEE volunteers who are also industry leaders and practitioners. So sort of thinking more broadly here, the electric grid being the greatest engineering achievement of the 20th century, it's really fueled the economic engine that brought prosperity and improved quality of life to billions of people worldwide. The system, however, is being tested increasingly by combination of physical and cyber-related threats, where terrestrial and space weather events are examples of threats that are occurring with greater frequency and intensity. If we go to the next slide, a lot of this are familiar with the audience, so I won't go into these details. But just say, understand that broadly speaking, there are a number of natural phenomena and man-made events that are impacting the performance of the electric grid. Beyond these, I think sort of the natural and man-made intentional harm, there are also the challenges of planning, designing, operating, and maintaining this very complex electrical grid, and issues such as resource adequacy, equipment response under extreme conditions, and power system stability and islanding are all important considerations. If we go to the next slide. What we can see here in the diagram here on the slide is there are a number of critical infrastructure sectors which are considered so vital to our well-being that their incapacitation or destruction would have the debilitating effect on the global economy, national security, and public health and safety. A diagram here really conveys the mutual dependencies between the electric power sector and that of the oil, transportation, natural gas supplies, to the communication network and water supply. And this is why the resilience of electric grid is uniquely critical, because it provides an enabling function across all critical infrastructure. Yet the electric grid is also dependent on a number of these supporting infrastructure as well. So on the broader scale, the dimension of power grid resilience covers not just power system performance, but also must include the dependency of its supply chain and encompasses economic, societal, national security considerations as well. So with that, let's get into sort of the conversation around resilience. I think we'll start with a bit more dialogue on reliability versus resilience and tease out the nuances between them. I would say in the traditional sense, reliability is much more understood term that comes with decades of perfecting the metric to measure in the context of power grid performance. Resilience, on the other hand, it's much more broader, has a much more broader meaning, and it's more complex to measure as well. If you think of reliability, you could think of it as defining the ability for power system to deliver electricity in the quantity and the quality expected by the end user. Reliability is generally measured by interruption indices, such as those by IEEE 1366, SAIDI, SAIFI, and so forth. Those are all very familiar to the industry. The diagram here shows on this slide, really it's a representation of the economic and social impacts of the range of events. As you can see intuitively, as the scope and scale of the events or the impact increases, as the outages duration extend from hours to days to weeks, we see a dramatic or exponential increase in the social and economic impact as well. Resilience, on the other hand, is really concerned with the ability of system to recover and in some cases transform from the disturbance and the severe adversity. Really the key point here, resilience is really not just trying to quantify an end state of system performance, such as reliability, but also the transition period among the various different states, as well as societal impacts, the consequences of limited inconvenience versus mass human suffering and casualties. Let's go to the next slide where we could sort of focus in a bit more on the nuances here. The chart here depicts what we call the resilience trapezoid. And the basic idea here is that system has a giving set of performance capability. And as the system experiences external traumas, the performance of the system is expected to degrade. And we should have the recognition that there is simply not enough capital and resources to build a system so strong such that it could withstand all sorts of different trauma and or to endure all the different possibilities, as the sky is really the limit here. But the key to resilience here is the transition between each of the stage of the resilient trapezoid process. So what we want to do is to build in resilience considerations such as the depth of the degradation of the performance is as shallow as possible, and the transition or the recovery period is as short as possible. And so I think finally an important consideration here is in the rebuilding process is where we can very quickly incorporate the lessons learned and not only restore to the original state, but also have the ability to make incremental improvements and hardening measures such that the system is actually better than where it started off. Let's go to the next slide. I think there's a lot of definition that's available. I won't go into these detail. Maybe just to hone in on the key points. I think we're short on time here. Is the frequency of the weather-related or security events has increased. These anomaly can no longer be treated as just low-frequency events. The reality here is the resilience consideration must encompasses the ability to protect against and recover from any events that would significantly impact the grid. If we go to the next slide, it's around how do we get better? I think this is where resilience metric comes in, but the challenge here is there is so many variables and some of the early work on defining metrics are so complex that it's virtually impossible to effectively implement, let alone derive value from metrics. Ultimately, it's trying to serve the purpose of being able to be benchmark and compare across industry participants and to facilitate continuous improvement. So the complexity of defining resilience highlights the need for more simplistic approach. There really is not a one-size-fits-all solution. Resilience metrics and investment are so dependent on various different factors, regional, functional, and regulatory contexts. Really, you could think of this as no different from a risk management approach. Start by identifying what is the risk that we're trying to mitigate, identify relevant performance parameters, apply these parameters with priority weighting and address risk by factoring probability and consequences. This is really sort of the root of risk management approach, and developing risk model to help facilitate and prioritize the process of investment decisions. If we go to the next slide, I think there's some commonality in looking across all the various different aspects of the events. And so the whole idea here is resilience, focusing on the recovery through the resilience trapezoid has many similarities in the process of prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. And so this is why the key takeaway here is approaching resilience by taking an all hazards approach to focus on all 5 areas and to collaborate with key stakeholders in maturing the resilience competency across these areas. I know we're really pressed on time, so I'm going to just quickly go over the next slide, just cover some of the key takeaway here. In the area of planning scenarios and grid hardening responses to weather-related events, there are existing weather modeling and expert weather services are available to incorporate into improved power system planning and modeling, including interdependencies among the electric, gas, and communication network. One example of this is the caladapt.org. It's a collaborative website that pulls together the knowledge base of industry practitioners and academic researchers. As with any modeling, there is no absolute right or wrong, but the beauty of this facilitation, this system, this platform, if you will, is to provide a level of transparency on the assumptions that can be applied across multiple critical infrastructure sectors. And as we're dealing with a plethora of risk scenarios, the planning and analytical approach also needs to move from the traditional deterministic scenario-based approach to more of a stochastic probability planning approach, and leverage the risk and probability-based modeling tool to value and prioritize resilience investment that address the greatest concern. The next couple of slides are an example of some of the practices that are available, that is being implemented today. And because the time limitation, I won't go into these details, maybe just flip to the next slide real quickly. Again, there are some sort of low-hanging fruit common practices that are easy to implement, things such as re-examining the construction standards. A lot of them are based on National Electric Safety Code low cases, performing meteorological studies to determine the appropriate local conditions based on learnings from recent events, and building in additional safety factors is one example of that. Definitely looking at changing the material in the distribution grid as well. Simple switch over from the traditional wood cross arm to fiberglass cross arm also provides a lot of benefit because it's not only is it 30% stronger than wood cross arm, but it will not rot or succumb to woodpeckers or other termite damages. Higher dielectric strength, which prevents the tracking and straying stray electricity on overhead structures. So there's a lot of benefits. So the paper has a lot of these details, so you certainly are welcome to download and read these at your leisure. So really wanted to go to the next slide just to bring it home here. In conclusion, we see electric grid resilience is the foundational building block for our clean energy future. It's going to require renewables, energy storage, and electrification, and the optimal deployment really requires investment in a resilient modern grid. The search for perfect resilience metrics will take some time and frankly may not be practical to have an all-encompassing comprehensive resilience measures. Rather, we recommend start with what we know now. Take concrete steps to identify relevant performance parameters, applying the appropriate weighting factor, apply the concept of risk management, risk modeling tool, factoring both probability and consequences, and leverage the risk framework for investment decisions. Finally, just leave you with this sort of call to action. The resilience consideration must be inclusive of a coordinated resource planning across generation, transmission and distribution, and operational domains. Now is the time to start actively plan for the prudent investment through a prioritization process. Finally, a comprehensive resilience plan must include the active involvement of diverse stakeholders, starting with regulators and policymakers at the federal and state level, the grid operators, local communities, and agency leaders. So that was a really quick flyover. Thank you very much. I'll call this a wrap for my presentation. Look forward to additional dialogue in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. And I want to thank the speakers for the excellent presentations. We've run out of time. We're not going to be able to do the Q&A during this hour session. Good news for you is all the presenters will be available in the forum session, which will start at 12:15. And the better news is we'll try to answer some of the questions that have come in via the chat. And I'll just mention that the questioners have asked us to make some comments about Texas. So we'll probably lead off with that in the forum session. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to John for the wrap up.
Hey, thanks, Frank. Man, what a great panel. It's so much great material presented. I want to thank Gladys and Gideon and John and Bill. And we're going to find a way to get some more time. But as you mentioned on the screen now, if you didn't get the link, here is the link to get you into the forum, which will start probably right at 12:15, maybe 12:20. But go ahead and once we drop here, log in. Remember, partnerships and sponsorships are available. If you want to become part of our team, shoot an email to me at info@eiscouncil.org. We'd love to have you join us. I think you'll see the benefit. We do have the handbook available. I did put the link into the chat box, but when you get your slides, the link on this slide will work. And we want to thank the foundation partners that made that masterwork for the EMP handbook available. And finally, just a few things to think about. We're bringing together some of the best in the world, as you noticed from today's speakers, just outstanding expertise. We're going to put forward a number of products this year. We want you to join us and we want you to become part of the team. So the EIS Council is happy to sponsor along with our partners. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and move forward. Join us on LinkedIn if you're a LinkedIn member. If not, jump on there and check out our website. And our next webinar is scheduled for 1 month later, 24 March. We're going to take a really hard look at water infrastructure resilience. What if there's no second chance? And you only need to look at Texas and then a little small event that happened down in Florida about 20 days ago that got a lot of national attention. One more time, thank you to all our partners. Frank, thanks for a great job. With that, I'm going to end this session, and then we will reconvene in about 10 minutes or less over on the forum. So thank you all very, very much.